Good morning. Today is Daf Samachet of a Masechet Avodah Zarah. We are at the top of Samachet Amud Aleph. I think on the fourth line, second word on the line, Amar Ula. Um, and yesterday we saw a machlokes about the concept of no sein tam lifgam, that if something is not kosher and it gets mixed into something that is kosher, if the thing that's not kosher gives the thing that is kosher a bad taste, if it ruins the dish, then according to Rebbe Meir, it doesn't make a difference and it's still going to be usser. Because after all, there's something not kosher in it. On the other hand, Rabbi Shimon says, no, if it gives it a bad taste, you didn't want it there, and as a result, it's a negative. It's not going to make the underlying item not kosher. And so that was the debate that we had yesterday. Now, the question that we have for the moment is, when does it make it not good? It's clear that if it's always not good, then, well, actually, this is what we're about to see. So let's take a look and see that there's going to be now a machlokas between Ula and Rabbi Yochanan as to the extent of the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. So again, Rabbi Meir says no sein tam lifgam asur, and Rabbi Shimon says no sein tam lifgam mutter. So Amar Ula, the machlokes, and again we are fourth line, Samachet Amud Aleph. Amar Ula machlokes shehishbiach ubasof pagam, that the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, as Rashi says, machlokes, fourth line in Rashi, machlokes de Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, shehishbiach ubasof pagam, that where it initially it helped the flavor, but then only later, because of the non-kosher thing that was mixed in, then it made it bad. But according to Ula, if in fact it made it bad from the moment, from the initial moment, as Rashi says, next Rashi, last words on the fourth line of Rashi, and then continuing in with the narrow lines, pogem mi'ikaro, misha shenafel letocho. As soon as the non-kosher item fell inside the mixture, the soup that is kosher, then all of a sudden, if it made the taste bad, well then it's going to be good and kosher. The whole mixture will be kosher according to everybody. That is Ula's opinion. Esve Rav Chaga le'Ula, so Rav Chaga challenges Ula. Yayin shenafel letoch adashim. We have a brisa that says that when wine that's not kosher falls into a lentil soup, the chometz or vinegar shenafel letoch grisin, that is also not kosher. This is wine vinegar that falls into these grisin, these beans that have been split. Asur, it's going to be prohibited. Now, presumably, this is talking about a situation where it's making the taste bad. And so, as a result, this Tanakama position that says that it's prohibited seems to be implying, actually, at the moment, the thought is that initially it's going to help the taste, and only later at the end will it harm the taste. And so that's the initial thought. And Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon says it's mutter because it's a pogame. It's eventually pogame. I'm sorry, I got myself confused. That according to Rav Chaga, this was talking about a situation where it was bad initially, and Ula said that the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon was only when it's eventually bad. And this shows that even when it's bad from the very beginning, it's going to be problematic. Upligi, and they're arguing. So as a result, doesn't that show that you're wrong, Ula? So as Rashi says, Right? This is the first line, and then going on to the second narrow line of Rashi on Samachet Amud Aleph. Dikatani Aser L'Rabbanan. Right? After all, the first opinion, the Tanakama opinion, which is Rashi referring to as the Rabbanan, but it's really Rebbe Meir, that is going to be prohibited. So Amar Ula says, no, you've got the case wrong. Chaga, lo meida yada maika amri rabbanim. One second, don't you know what the rabbis of that brisa are talking about? To yuv to kamosiv, you're trying to bring a challenge. Hakaba mayaskin, and here's what they're talking about. Kagon shenafel atok grisin sonanin v'herticham. No, what happened was, and we saw this, I think yesterday, or in terms of the topic, that the timing of when vinegar falls into the split beans makes a big difference. If it falls in while it's hot, then it's going to make things terrible immediately. But if it falls in while it's cold and then you heat it up, so then initially it was going to be helpful. And only then, when you heated it up, then it became harmful. So naze kamisha hishbiach ulbaso pagam. That's a case where it became good in the beginning, and then in the end it became bad. Va'asur, and that's the situation where Rabbi Meir prohibits. And that's again consistent with Ula's position that they argue in connection where it's initially helpful and in the end harmful. But everybody would agree if it's always harmful, then it's going to be permitted. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, as Rashi says, Ad Ula asaklim ifluge, that he's coming to argue with Ula, and he says b'pogem ikara machlokas. No, the machlokas is if it was always bad, and so now the question ibailahu b'pogem ikara machlokas aval hishbiach u'basov pagam divrei kol aser. Odilma bein bazo machlokas. Now, when you say that there's a machlokas in connection with the situation where it's bad from the very beginning and always bad, does that mean that if it was initially good and becomes bad, it's also going to be a machlokas? Or is that going to be a situation where they all agree that it's going to be prohibited? Because obviously that's a less bad situation, and so maybe if it's less bad, we'll say that there's that everybody agrees that it's going to be prohibited. And Teku, the Gemara leaves it unresolved. We actually paskin that actually if it doesn't make a difference whether it's hishbiach u'basov pagam or pagam u'basov hishbiach. If it becomes good or it was good at any point in time, so then it's going to be usher. And so no St. Tom, even though if it gave a taste. But if it's always no St. Tom lefgam, if it's mikara ad sof, that it's going to just be a bad taste, well, then that's the situation where we paskin that it is permitted. Okay. So
I have a question. Campbell's porking beans is less than 1/60th pork. And so no rabbi certifies it. But for those of us who don't like pork and think it makes it worse, it ought to be permitted.
So that's an interesting question of whose opinion do we say that it has to be that it's making things worse? Right. So it is clear that it is not just your own personal opinion. It is on some level an objective standard, even though it's by definition subjective, meaning that it can't just be your personal opinion. And indeed, we are going to see a whole situation with small animals being in things by the end of the day today, and the question is that an exception to the rule, or is it effectively you have to look at what is generally acceptable and not acceptable? And so by definition, I would suggest to you that if in fact they're selling the item with the pork in it, and then I would say it's going to be not treated as no Saint Tom Lifgam. Now the fact is that and presumably the taste is in it. That's why it's
Yeah.
called the soup. So
And
so
obviously Campbell's thinks it makes it better.
correct, exactly. And so you can't use sort of your own private personal feelings to sort of justify, oh, I don't like the way cheese tastes, and so as a result, it's totally permitted for me to have a cheeseburger. That well, first of all, there would always be the problem of having the item in it. So to the extent that you see any pork, you would have to pull that out. The question is sort of like what's left after you pull the pork out. I don't know whether there are pieces of pork in that the soup that you were referencing, but in any
Yeah.
event, but that would certainly be a minimal requirement. But let's now go through and see where is it? What's the basis for Rabbi Yochanan suggesting that the machlokas is even when everything is bad from the start, and not just and that there is that we don't say like Ula, because again, Ula says that if everything is bad from the start and always, then everybody agrees that it's permitted. So we're going to now try and find a case where Rabbi Meir says that even though something was detrimental from the very beginning, he still says that it's usher. So Amar of Amram, Evshar Isa Lahad Rabbi Yochanan below Tanya Labamasnisin. Is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan would say something and not have figured it out from some source of the Tanaim? So Nafak Dak the Ashkach. He went out and he looked around and he found Ditnan that it says in the Mishnah in Orla, Parak Bet Mishnah Tet, Sa'ur shel chulin shenafel tocha isa. If you've got some leaven, sa'ur that is chulin, and it falls into a dough. Now everything right now is totally fine. It's totally kosher. The chulin is just means that it's just not. There's no kodesh aspect to it. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz v'hichmitza, and it has enough in order to make the dough rise, and it does, in fact, make the dough rise. V'acharkach nafal seor shel truma o seor shel kilei hakerem. And now into it falls more leaven, but the leaven is not kosher for everybody, either because it's truma or it's kolayim. And kolayim is considered something that's prohibited when we talk about kolay kerem from a vineyard, meaning that it got mixed in with grapes. That is actually prohibited to benefit from the Torah. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz. And the new amount that fell in also had the ability to create something that was prohibited. And so as a result, asur v'Rabbi Shimon matir. So we see that there's a machlokes in this case, and that's totally fine. And Rashi explains, if we take a look at Rashi, v'Rabbi Shimon matir, shehechamitza yoter midai v'nifkama. Because why did Rabbi Shimon say it's permitted? Because the second round of leaven going into this dough is making it taste terrible because it's put too much of the leaven into it. And so as a result, it makes it sour. And yet, when did it become prohibited? And when did it become tasting of bad? It both happened at the same moment. And yet we see here the Tanakama in this Mishnah says that it's prohibited. As Rashi says, Vahahacha, the next Rashi, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down, last word on the line. Vahahacha, dahai seor, misha shenafel be pagma. As soon as it fell in, this non-kosher, either truma or klea kerem, seor, that as soon as it fell in, shahare michumetzes kvar v'ka'asar, because it already had enough to make it to leaven, and so v'ka'asar Rabbi Meir, and the Rabbi Meir in that Mishnah says that it is prohibited. Now, of course, it doesn't say clearly that the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but it's the Tanakama in that Mishnah. So as a result, isn't that a proof? Rav Amram says to Rabbi Yochanan and a big problem for Ula. So not necessarily. Amar Rabbi Zera says shiny Isa. You could argue that dough is different. Hoil uruya lachameya ba kama isos acheros. Because what can you do with dough that has been over leavened? It actually can serve. I have no idea about this. I'm not a baker, so if you're a baker out there, you can confirm this for me. But basically, if the dough has been over leavened, now that dough can essentially be used to leaven other doughs. And so as a result, it's not necessarily a bad thing. As we take a look in Rashi, 1, 2, 3, it's the next Rashi, the beginning of the line has the rate shmem for Rabbi Meir. V'reuya lachameya ba kama isos acheros shel truma. So it has the ability to leaven other things of truma. Hilkach chimutz de yoter midai. Therefore, the fact that it got too much leaven in it, afal pisha pagam hula inyan achila, even though when it comes to eating it, it would not necessarily be a good thing. Or as if you look in the Bach, it says inyan achilas isa zu. When it comes to eating this dough, but shevachu le'inyan chimua isos acheros. But it's a good thing in terms of allowing this dough to now cause other doughs to rise. And so as a result, it is not considered pagam me'ikara. And so as a result, Ula could be right about the machlokas of Reb Meir and Rabbi Shimon. So now we try again to support Rabbi Yochanan's argument that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon argue even when it's bad from the beginning. Because remember, Ula says no, they agree that if it's bad from the beginning, that it's all going to be okay. So Tashma, here's another brisa. This brisa deals with 4 different cases. We're going to first have 3. That will be sufficient for our proof, and then we'll bring in the 4th to help, or at least initially thought to be sufficient for our proof, and then we'll bring in the 4th. So let's go through the 4 cases. Se'ur shel truma v'shel chulin. So you have both some leaven that's truma and some leaven that's chulin, and shenaflu tocha isa, and it all falls into the dough. And the dough, of course, is fine kosher dough. And both of them, both the truma and the chulin seor, are enough to give it the leavening that it needs. And so as a result, v'chimtzu, and they actually leaven the dough together. So, and they each could have done it on their own, but now you've got too much. Asur, it's prohibited. And it's prohibited, presumably according to Rabbi Meir, because there's now too much. Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon says that it's permitted. Nafal shel truma tchila, if on the other hand, the one that fell in first was the truma seor, and so as a result, the truma seor caused the good leavening, and everything was wonderful for the moment, divrei kol asur. Then everybody agrees that it's going to be prohibited because at the moment it was put in, everything tasted great. Nafal shel chulin, but on the other hand, if the chulin went in first, va'akarkak nafal shel truma, and then the truma fell in, o shel kilei hakar kerem, or if it was kilayim from the vineyard, meaning involved grapes, asur, then it's going to be prohibited. Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon says it's permitted. Now, in this last case, it seems like it should be permitted according to Ula, because in this last case, it was the taste was bad from the very moment that the Isser fell into it. So why do we have anybody who says that it's prohibited? And yet we see that it was bad from the very beginning, and there's an argument. And if you say, yeah, you're absolutely right, when you turn to Samachet Amabet, Kid Rebbe Zera, we already had this question and we already answered the question. Remember, Rebbe Zera said, as Rashi tells us and reminds us, because he said it a few moments ago, but we'll use Rashi as our crutch to help us remember. Dechimutz yoser midai shevachu, that when you have too much leaven in a dough, it isn't only bad because it helps things. When it comes to causing other doughs to rise. And so as a result, according to Ula, even though ordinarily he would say that everyone agrees that if it's bad from the beginning, it would be kosher, he would admit that if there's a dimension in which it's positive, so then it would still be problematic according to Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Shimon, he would say, and that one dimension of being good is not enough to overcome the fact that when it comes to taste, and that's really what we're talking about, because we're talking about the prohibition of consuming it, that when it comes to taste, if it makes it bad tasting, so then it's going to be, even from the beginning, so then the Rebbe Shimon would say that it's going to be permitted. So, but yeah, okay, you want to get around case number 3, but listen, Tashma Miseva, you got the fourth case of that brisa. Because what does that fourth case say? And a key here is that it doesn't deal with leavening. Hayayin shenafel atoch adashim. If you've got wine that falls into
Turn
lentils.
off the volume. You
I'm
turned off the
sorry,
volume.
I didn't turn off anything. I think everything's working for my end. Um,
You
uh,
I'm here.
should.
can you still hear me, Charlie?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So you check on your computer, Ken. Hayayin shenafel atoch adashim. If you've got wine that falls into lentils, v'chometz shenafel atoch gerisin, or vinegar that falls into the beans that are split. So asur, it's going to be prohibited. So here again we have the Rebbe Shimon matir, and Rebbe Shimon says it's permitted. V'hachanami depagam mikara. Now, isn't this a case of where it makes things bad from the very beginning? Upligi, and they're arguing. And if you say, yeah, all right, you want to tell me that case? Ukidishani ula Rebbe Chaga kishehishbiach ubaso pagam. You want to say, well, don't forget that when we started today, Rabbi Chaga asked the question of Ula about these exact cases, and Ula answered him and said, we're dealing with a situation where everything is cold, and therefore it was actually enhancing the flavor initially, and it only in the end harmed the flavor. But umi pligi besof pagam. But 1 second, do they really argue when everything is prohibited and then when it actually it makes it better and then in the end makes it worse? Bahakatani. But in the Brisa's case of the second case, where we say nafel shel truma tchila divrei akol asur. According to even Rebbe Shimon, it's prohibited. Now, if in fact something that was originally good and then became bad is going to be permitted according to Rebbe Shimon, well, then why in this brisa does he say that if the truma falls in first and then the chulin falls in afterwards, where it initially it tasted great with the isser, but now that you added extra, it was added extra leavening, it tastes terrible again. And so, if what matters is only the end taste, and Rabbi Shimon says that in that situation it should be permitted, why does he say in the second case of this brisa that it's prohibited? Doesn't that show that in fact, according to Rabbi Shimon and according to Rabbi Meir, if it's initially good and becomes bad, it's not going to be kosher. It's going to be prohibited. So yes, that's in fact what it says. Elalab shmamina de pagami karamachlokas. This shows that it must be that Rabbi Yochanan is right when he says that the machlokas is when everything is bad from the beginning. And shmamina, in fact, we've proven it that the halacha is like, and that the Mishnayos go like Rabbi Yochanan, not like Ula. And in fact, Rabbi Yochanan is correct, and that's the way we paskin. That in fact, if you add something and it enhances the flavor initially, then it's going to be not kosher, even if that changes down the line. And so as a result, there's nothing that you can do about it to make it kosher again. It's going to be prohibited.
So what's Rabbi Shimon's what would be Rabbi Shimon's conclusion? And then it seems like there's still within Rabbi Shimon he has two views, right?
No. So everybody agrees that Rabbi Shimon says that when it comes to something that it tastes bad initially and tastes bad later, it's going to be permitted. According to Ula, he expands Rabbi Shimon to where it tastes bad, where it tastes good from the beginning and bad at the end. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with that, and we've now proven that Rabbi Yochanan is correct. And so as a result, Rabbi Shimon's ruling is limited to where it's always bad. And even in that situation where it's always bad, Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Meir says that that is still prohibited. And that was the debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Ula. Rabbi Yochanan says that the debate is only in connection where it's all bad, where it's always bad. Whereas Rabbi Meir says no, everybody agrees when it's always bad. Even Rabbi Meir would say it's kosher when it's always bad, and the machlokus is only when it's initially good and becomes bad. Okay, so we've now rejected that, and so we now limit ourselves to where it's always bad. Rabbi Meir says that that's still not kosher. We don't paskin like Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shimon says it's good when it is kosher when it's always bad, and that's how we in fact paskin.
So Rabbi, I thought you said, well, I'm confused. Rabbi Meir said if it's always bad, it's good. Now he says
that was Ula's position, and we rejected Ula's position.
Oh, it's Ula's. So Rabbi Meir, what is Rabbi Meir's position?
So Rabbi Meir's position is no matter what, doesn't make a difference what it tastes like. If you add something not kosher, it's not kosher.
And if it tastes bad,
even if it adds bad taste. The only situation where Rabbi Meir we have to do is maybe if it's buttal, if it's nullified, if there's no taste whatsoever. So then maybe he would agree that it's okay. But clearly, if it adds a bad taste, if it adds any taste, it doesn't make a difference. You've added something that's not kosher, and it's affected the taste. It's not kosher. Again, we don't paskin that way. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon, that if it adds a bad taste from the beginning to the end, then it's going to be kosher. So Hani Tlasa.
Rabbi Meir would only say this if it's a product that's not kosher. If it just tastes bad and it just it disrupts.
Yeah, of course. If there's nothing not kosher in it, then it's still kosher. You could have lots of bad things. There are lots of bad cooks out there, and their food is still kosher even if it tastes bad.
All right.
Okay. Hani Tlasa Bave de Katani Lama. Now we actually had 4 cases in this brisa, but the Gemara references 3 of them. There's machlokas among the Rishonim as to which 3 it refers to. But let's take a look, and we'll see which ones are referenced and which ones are not. But the first case is the case of again, the first case is when two things fall in at the same time. The second case was the bad thing falls in first. The third case is where the good thing falls in first, and the fourth case was not had nothing to do with leaven. It had to do with the wine and the vinegar. So those were the four cases, and so we're going to focus on cases 1, 2, and 4. So Hani Tlas Abave to Katani Lamali. Why did we need all of them? So Bishlam Abava de Seifa, we understand why we need the case of the wine and the vinegar, Kamash Malan de Pogem Mi'ikara Machlokes, because that was the key. That was the key for us to understand that there was a machlokes between Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Shimon in connection with even when the flavor is bad from the very beginning, right? In some ways, cases 3 and 4 are being grouped together. That case 3 and 4 we need. Now, of course, with just case 3, the problem is that because it was leaven, there was an argument that Rebbe Zarah offered us that it wasn't a perfect proof, that in fact it shows that it's bad, that if it's bad from the beginning, they still argue. And therefore we needed case 4. But the bottom line is that those cases 3 and 4 together clearly show that the machlokas between Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Shimon is even when things are bad from the very beginning, as soon as you add the non-kosher item. Mitziasan Nami. And the middle case also, when the truma falls in first, and then you add the kosher leaven, hishbiach ubasot pagam divrei kol aser. We need to tell us that because I might have thought that there would be a machlokes between Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Shimon when things are initially good and become bad. And it tells us, this piece of the brisa tells us, that actually Rebbe Shimon agrees with Rebbe Meir that it's not kosher if it was initially good, even though later it becomes bad. Elaresha Lamali, why did the brisa need to tell me about the first case of where they fall in at the same time? Hashta uma seifa delo kamashbach kalal asrei rabbanim. In the case where we have that the Tanakama, in the last section, he says that it's prohibited from the very, even though there was nothing bad initially that was contributing in a positive way, and yet he says that it's bad. So Reisha de Komashbach mi boy. I don't need you to tell me. Of course, Rebbe Meir / the Tanakama would say in the last case, in the first case, that it's going to be bad. Because after all, in the first case, the Truma Isa and the Chulin Isa fell in at the same time. So you had the Truma Isa working and improving the dough, and so of course he's going to say that it's prohibited. And I am sure you've already figured out the Gemara's answer, and Abaye tells us it. Amar Abaye Reisha Rabbi Shimon Itzrich. No, it's not to tell you the strength of Rebbe Meir's prohibition. It's to tell you the strength of Rebbe Shimon's permission. Because the rabbis, namely Rebbe Meir, could say to Rebbe Shimon, hey, if you had put in only just the chulin or just the truma seor, it would have taken 2 hours to leaven. But now that you put them both in, mi garam la shetachmet b'sha achas, what causes it all to go so quickly? Isser. It was the contribution of the Isser Isa, namely the Truma Seor, the Isser Seor, the Asser Seor, namely the Truma Seor, that you put that in, and it helped things initially. And yet Rabbi Shimon says back, no, Kishe hishpichu shneim hishpichu. Kishe pagmu shneim pagmu. Yeah, you might have had both of them helping, but they both made it bad also. And as a result, it wasn't primarily a good and then a bad, but rather it was all working at the same time, all making it. And as a result, according to Rabbi Shimon, it is not a case of Shevach Mi'ikara and Pugam in the end, but rather it's as if it's Pugam from the very beginning. So Rabbi Shimon, litztaref heter ve'isser bahadi hadade ve'litzar. Well, one second, why don't we just say combine the two and now make it as if the combination is making it better initially and then making it bad? So why not combine them? So Rabbi Shimon l'taimei. Rabbi Shimon, according to his reasoning, da'amar afilu iser ve'iser nami lo mitztarfe. He does not combine even two prohibited items. So he's certainly not going to combine a prohibited item with a kosher item. Ditznan, because he's the one who said in the following Mishnah, this is a Mishnah, Orla, Perek Bet, Mishnah Aleph, Orla, Uchleya Kerem Mitzdarfin, that the Tanakhama says that you can combine if you don't quite have enough Orla or enough Kalayim to constitute a prohibition, and yet you add the two together and now you do have enough. So that's fine. You can add the two together. After all, they're both prohibited. And so it's fine to add the two together. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, ain mitzdarfin. We don't add them together. Now, Tosos asks here, in the Tosos to the Rabbi Shimon, litzdarfe heter le'isser, he has an interesting question. The Im Tomer, take a look, third Tosos down, Samachet Amabed. The Im Tomer, amai lo tali bebuksayo bezev gorim. Why are we not actually saying, hey, what's happening here? We are adding kosher seor and non-kosher seor. So don't we have one thing that's doing good, one thing that's helping that's kosher, one thing that's helping that's not kosher, and we have a principle of zev zegorim when two different things create something or cause something. Remember, we saw back. Now it's a couple of weeks ago where you crushed up the idol and you put it and it somehow became fertilizer, and now you have zegorim. You have the natural land that is helping things grow, and you have this fertilizer that's prohibited and making things grow. And we said that we're going to create the concept of zegorim, and we're going to learn from that to see, is it permitted or is it not? And we had a machlokas there. To so perak kolat slamim, as we saw back on Daf Mem Tedom and Aleph. So why don't we say the same thing here? Why don't we incorporate that machlokas here? And Tosos therefore adds a very important point in order to help us understand the concept of zev zegorim. Zev zegorim only applies when you don't have the full amount necessary to accomplish the goal of the two items. That in neither of them is there enough. And the Hagoza Bach adds the words again, kedei lahachmitz, that in neither of them is there enough to cause the leavening to happen. And so ki mitzdarfe, and now when they come together, havale zev zegorim, that's the situation where we say zev zegorim. Aval kishiyesh b'kol echad kedei lahachmitz, but when both of them have enough on their own to do the job, Ein shayach zev zegorim. We do not apply the principle of the zev zegorim. Va'afilu man deshari hasam, and even the one that would ordinarily permit over there, asar hacha, he would say over here it's prohibited. And so as a result, we can't rely on zev zegorim is mutter and say, oh, Rabbi Shimon just says that zev zegorim is mutter, and that's why. But rather we have to say, no, Rabbi Shimon says ein mitzdarfim, that you can't add two different things together to get something else. And so as a result, that's why we answer it the way we do. And so as a result, Rabbi Shimon would say, we don't add the the two different seor together, and therefore we're going to treat it as if, even though they came in at the same time, we're going to treat it as if it is pagam meikara, and therefore, because it was more than enough already to cause the pigum from the very beginning, and therefore it's going to all be kosher in that case, because we're not going to sort of separate it into the different moments and say, oh well, initially you know, in the first hour it didn't yet ruin the flavor, so therefore it's going to be okay. No, we look at the whole thing and it's all in there, and therefore even from the very beginning it's problematic. Okay, now
Does
let's
he have a
talk.
proportion? I
What?
mean, you put a certain amount of, in this case, what is it? The
Sore.
SOR, but that would be beneficial versus that which is not beneficial. Is there a certain proportion, 10%, 20%,
So
80%?
I don't know. That's, you have to talk to a baker on that. But what we're talking about here is, remember, you put in double. The key is that you put in double. That's why it's going to be permitted according to Rabbi Shimon. You put in double from the very beginning. Half of it was kosher, half of it was not kosher. But because you put in double from the very beginning and the part was not kosher, we're going to say that the part that's, and that doubling of it makes it all taste bad. We're going to say that therefore it's all permitted according to Rabbi Shimon. And that's the way we paskin. So hahu achbara dinafal visa de shechra. So we now have now we're going to get to the animal case that I mentioned at the earlier today that we would get to at the end. We have a mouse and it fell into a barrel of beer. Osrei Rav Lahu Shechra. Rav says that that beer is prohibited. Amarua Rabbanan Kameda Rav Sheshes. So the rabbis said this in front of Rav Sheshes. Nema Kasavar Nosim Tamlif Gam Asr. Could it be that he's holding that when you actually, because of course nobody wants a mouse in their beer, so the assumption, the presumption at the moment is that it must be that he holds that if you have something that imparts a bad flavor, it's actually going to be prohibited, meaning that it doesn't this mean that Rab is holding like Rabbi Meir, and we don't hold like Rabbi Meir, so this is really a problem. And Rashi helps us out here. I'm sorry, Tosos here helps us out. Fourth Tosos from the bottom. It's a short Tosos. Hahu achbra denafel begocha visa de shikra asrei l'rav asrei rav lahu shikra. The Rav prohibited that beer. Tema dahat sonein bitsonein hu velishtere. Why in the world are we even thinking about bad taste? Meaning, how come we can't just say pull out the mouse, everything's cold, and it's going to be fine? V'yesh lomar demayri shisha sham yomo yomayim. It's where it was there for a day or two. V'haya kavush, and we have a principle that if something is soaking in water and it's not kosher, it's as if the item in that's soaking there is cooking. And so as long as it's there for more than 24 hours, we consider that as if the item has been cooked. And this is a very important principle. We do hold of this principle of kavush. And so as a result, if you have a plastic container that you put cold soup into, and now you put that plastic container into the refrigerator and it's there for 24 hours, that plastic container, even though it never touched hot anything, it is now considered fully fleishix, as if the soup had been cooked in there. And that's actually the way we paskin. So it's important to understand this principle. So the v'haya kavush b'tochas shechar. And so as a result, it's as if it cooked in the beer. V'kavush and the harihu kamavushal. And when it's soaked, it's as if it's cooked. And so that's the concept that we're talking about here. So all right. So now we understand how
So we
that tastes.
machmir here.
What?
So if it's suffix here, the hakmir, if you don't know, you walk in, you see the mouse in the barrel, you're going to assume that it was there for 24 hours, or you have to see
Maybe.
it, or you have to see it fall, or what?
I think the question, given that it's well, we'll talk about the beer in a moment because we're going to get back to the beer just in a second. Because in the end, I think we're going to say that actually the beer is okay because of no Saint Tamlith Gam. But at the moment, we're going to explain why and how Rav can say that the beer is not kosher. Okay. And not yet, and still, and not yet, and not necessarily agree with Rebbe Meir of Nosim Tam Lifgam Aser. So Amr lahu Rav Sheshis said to them, Ba'alma Sava Rav Nasan, Rav Nosin Tam Lifgam Mutter. Really? Rav believes, as we know and we paskin, like Rabbi Shimon, that when it gives a taste that's bad, it is going to be permitted. But what's the situation? V'hacha chidishu. Here it's a chiddush. Now, the term chiddush in the Talmud generally means that something is not as you would expect, meaning that based on other principles in the Chumash, you'd expect X, and yet the Torah tells us Y. So, for example, you have basar and chalab, that ordinarily, when you add two things that are kosher together, you end up with something that's kosher. And yet here you end up with something that's not kosher. And so as a result, that's a case of chiddush. So here too, we're saying hadamimas mis ubedile in shemine, that really sheretz is disgusting and you would never eat it. And so as Rashi says, we're middle of the narrow lines of Rashi, beginning of the line, mimias ubilav azhara, without any prohibition in the Torah, bedilin in shemine, people would never go and eat a mouse. The lamalei azher rachmana. So why aleha? So why does the Torah tell us there's a prohibition? Shma mina afil nosein tam lifgam aser. So according to Rashi's understanding, the reason that the Torah gave us a prohibition of eating a mouse and eating a shrutzim is in order to tell us that actually when it comes to shrutzim, even if it's nosein tam lifgam, it's aser. And so as a result, even so, the Torah prohibited, and as we go back into the Gemara, hilkach nosein tam lifgam nami aser. When it comes to shrutzim, that's when we're going to say that it's going to be prohibited. Okay? Tosfos has a slightly different understanding. Tosfos says, one second, that really isn't consistent. What Rashi's saying is that the Torah didn't need to tell us it because people would find it repulsive. Tosfos suggests that no, it's not that people would find it repulsive. It's that we have the principle of nosein tam lifgam mutter. And so as a result, this contradicts the basic principle of nosein tam lifgam mutter. And so as a result, even so, the Torah prohibits it. And so as a result, that must show that in this case, we're going to say nosein tam lifgam is usser, even though we generally say that it's mutter. But either way, we end up at the same point. And we've now explained Rav by saying, yes, he does think that nosein tam lifgam is generally mutter, but there's a special exception when it comes to shrutzim. So Amru le Rabbanan le Rav Sheshis. The rabbis say to Rav Sheshis, no, I don't think so. Ela me'ata litame lach v'yavesh. But one second, then if we're going to use this concept that when the Torah says something that it didn't need to tell us, it's telling us some kind of additional chiddush that we need to add to the concept. Well, the same thing should be true when it comes to tuma. Meaning that ordinarily when it comes to a dead mouse, it's only when there's still moisture in the mouse that it's going to create tuma of a sheretz, of a creepy crawly thing. But once it's all dried out and there's no sort of moisture left in the corpse of the mouse, well, then it does not cause tuma. But if you're telling me that the prohibition wasn't necessary, and so as a result, the Torah was adding to it, so just as it adds to the prohibition to say nosein tam lifgam aser, it should add to the prohibition and say, hey, the mouse is different from other kinds of tuma. And even when it doesn't have any kind of moisture whatsoever, it should be prohibited. But alama tanan mitamin lachem, that when it comes to a sheretz, it's going to only create tuma when it's moist. Ve'ein metamin yaveshim, and it doesn't actually create tuma when it's dried. Ulatam. So now the Gemara responds and says, no, not necessarily. Ulatamech shichvat zero titame lach v'yavish. But that same principle of saying, well, you gave me an extra prohibition, and therefore it should include more than necessarily we would have thought otherwise. Why don't we say that same thing about Shechvat Zera and an emission of a man, the semen? So alama tanan. Yet we see in that same mission that we just cited, mitamin lachen ve'em mitamin yavation. The semen only transmits tuma when it's moist, not when it's dry. Elamai isloch lamemar. So what's the explanation? Meaning, there's really, maybe you're right that we should expand it. But I'll tell you why. When it comes to both Shechvat Zera and the Sheretz, we limit to the Tuma to when it's moist and not when it's dry. Because Shechvat Zera Amarachmana, it says specifically Zera, meaning that it's going to somehow enable Beru'uya Lahazriya. It has to be capable of fertilizing. And if it's dried, the semen, then presumably we understand from a, at least then, technological perspective. I have no idea if it can, whether it's true or not. I presume it's true. So that it wouldn't be able to fertilize. So hachinami bimosam amarachmana. When it talks about the death of the sheretz, ke'ein mosam. It's like the moment that they die. When the moment that they die, they have some kind of moisture in them. They're still there, and so that's the situation. So maskif la Rav Shimi l'menarda umi meyis. But one second. Is a mouse really repulsive? V'ha'ola al shulchan shel malachim. There are kings that serve cooked mice, apparently. So Amar of Shimi Minarda, no, lo kashya, ha b'dedavra, ha b'demasa. In the first situation of the city mouse and the field mouse, this is maybe the person who told the story of the city mouse and the field mouse maybe learned this Gemara before he came up with the story, that there's a difference between field mice and city mice. City mice are pretty repulsive because they're all through the trash. Field mice, they are part of nature. And just as you eat animals in part of nature, so too the field mice are part of nature. And so as a result, it's the field mice that would go on the tables of kings, not the city mice. Amar Rava. So Rava is going to now reject Rav Shesh's point of view and say I don't understand Rav. I don't like Rav Shesh's perspective. Hilchasa, no saying tam lefgam mutter. The halacha is that if it gives a taste that's bad, it is permitted. And when it comes to the mouse in the beer, lo yadana my time of the Rav. I don't know the reasoning of Rav. Because in the end, I believe that it should be kosher. Because if he holds that it gives a bad taste, that it's usher, that it's still usher, it would mean that the halacha is not like him. No vav. Imishum to kasaber nosing tam lefgam mutter, and if in fact he holds that something gives a bad taste, it's going to be permitted. The achvara b'shikre ashbuchi mashbach. You're going to tell me that the beer tastes better as a result of the mouse? Of course not. And so as a result, bottom line is we say that even in the beer case, it seems like we would say that the halacha is that the beer is kosher, even if the mouse was in the beer overnight, because it adds a bad taste and it's really disgusting. And hopefully we don't have any beer that has mice in it. So
don't we say if a animal or a fly or something falls in the soup or tea, we just remove it and drink the rest of it?
Absolutely. But remember, in that situation, there's no kibush, right? So the point is that you're exactly right. Now, there wouldn't be a question if it's at all if it's not yad soletisbo, right? Meaning if it's not hot enough to cook. And usually when you have the soup, we're not talking about it's in a bowl, right? But the point is that And so usually it's a kli sheni, kli shlishi, and so as a result, it's not going to be considered sufficiently hot enough to cook. But you're right, if it falls into the cooking soup, if a fly falls into it, we generally say that you can pull it out. Again, that's based on this no Saint Tom Lefgam that we say it's mutter. And if you say, oh, what about the famous midrash associated with Haman, where Haman says to King Achashverosh, this people are so crazy. If a fly flies into their wine, they'll just pull out the fly and they'll drink the wine. Whereas if you touch their wine, they won't drink it.
Right,
So that's, you're absolutely right. 100%. But remember that the second component here, and that's why the Tosos Hahu Akbara is so important. The Tosos says that we're dealing with a case of kibush where it was there for 24 hours. So that's why we have to worry about the taste. But you're right. If we don't have to worry about the taste, then it's certainly going to be permitted according to everybody. Charlie, you had a question?
He asked the question I was going to ask.
Awesome. Amazing. All right. So the Gemara up until this point has discussed the case of a mouse that fell into beer. What if the mice fall into vinegar? Well, that you're going to have to wait for tomorrow's daf. I look forward to continuing our learning together. Have a fabulous, fabulous day.
I have a Shiloh.
Yes.
Okay.
Is it related to the daf?
It's not related to the dove.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Have a great day, everybody.
And I don't